He's pardoned for 100 years. All right, what does that leave? Only one thing.
The Magnificent Seven is a film born from a Japanese masterpiece and was brought to life by Yul Brynner's determination. Behind the gunfights were rivalries that nearly tore the set apart, improvisations that changed key scenes, and filming conditions in Mexico that tested every actor's endurance. Today, we're uncovering 20 weird and fascinating facts you probably didn't know about this timeless classic. Adapted from Seven Samurai. When you sit down to watch The Magnificent Seven, I'm sure everything about it gives you the feeling that it's a classic American Western. The vast desert skies, the tough men in black hats, and the poor villagers begging for protection. But here's the twist. Many people don't realize that the entire story came from Japan. Yeah, you heard right. 6 years before the film hit theaters in 1960, Akira Kurosawa had released a film he called Seven Samurai. It was a black and white epic film that ran for almost 3.5 hours. In that film, desperate farmers begged a wandering group of samurai to protect them from merciless bandits. Yul Brynner, who would later become the leader of the seven gunfighters in the Magnificent Seven, was so struck by Kurosawa's story that he wanted to bring it to American audiences. He didn't just star in the movie. He worked behind the scenes to help secure the remake rights. Brynner knew it was risky, and he saw Kurosawa's work was dense, slow at times, and very Japanese in its cultural roots. Brynner also knew that underneath all that was a universal idea he could bring to life. Ordinary people relying on a band of outsiders to defend them. Director John Sturges stepped in and decided to swap katanas for Colt revolvers, rice fields for dusty Mexican landscapes, and samurai honor for cowboy grit. The film's plot stayed the same at its heart, but the tone and culture around it shifted into something uniquely Western. What makes this even more interesting is that Kurosawa himself saw the Magnificent Seven and praised it. He recognized that the spirit of his story had survived the journey across cultures. So the next time you watch Brynner and his men ride into that small village, we hope you remember that those saddles and six-shooters used to be samurai with sharp swords. Brynner bought the remake rights. After watching The Magnificent Seven, most people only remember Yul Brynner as the bald gunslinger who led the Seven into battle. But what many of these people don't know is that he was also the man who helped bring the Magnificent Seven to life in the first place. Brynner was not just an actor for hire on this project, he was one of its driving forces. After the success of Seven Samurai in the mid-1950s, Hollywood producers toyed with the idea of remaking it. Still, the process was messy because of legal rights, translation issues, and cultural differences, which made studios hesitate. Brynner stepped in and personally secured the rights to adapt Kurosawa's story into a Western setting. His decision to secure the rights shows his belief in the project. He had already made his mark on Hollywood then with films like The King and I and The Ten Commandments. Once he had the rights to make his version of Kurosawa's film, he took on a role behind the scenes, but he worked closely with United Artists and producer Walter Mirisch. This was uncommon behavior for a leading actor in that era because most stars simply showed up when the cameras rolled, but Brynner worked hard to shape the very foundation of the film. He fought for John Sturges to direct, pushed for strong co-stars, and even had a say in the look and feel of the final production. Shot on location in Mexico. If you think back to The Magnificent Seven or watch it again, you would notice that one thing stands out: how real the world feels. From the dusty roads to the sun-baked mountains, the small village seems to live and breathe with its people. How real it looks and feels is no accident because the movie was filmed almost entirely in Mexico. The crew set up in Cuernavaca and Tepoztlan for the outdoor shots, and they used the Churubusco studios in Mexico City for certain interiors. Filming in Mexico was cheaper than shooting in the United States, but came with its share of problems. The production team had to deal with unexpected weather, equipment shortages, and language barriers between the Hollywood crew and the local workers. Even small things like food and lodging became significant issues because the cast and crew had to stay in remote areas. At times, the heat was unbearable and dust storms made it nearly impossible to keep the cameras rolling smoothly. But despite the challenges, filming in Mexico gave the movie the necessary authenticity that could never have been recreated on a Hollywood set. The Mexican extras, many of whom were locals from nearby villages, added layers of realism to the film. Director John Sturges later admitted during interviews that shooting in Mexico tested everyone's patience to know how much they could handle and endure. Still, it also pushed the film into a league of its own. The rugged beauty of the landscapes and the authentic village setting turned The Magnificent Seven from just another Western film into something timeless. Cinematography, Charles Lang and Panavision. One of the reasons The Magnificent Seven feels so grand and unforgettable is because of how it was shot. And the man behind the camera was none other than Charles Lang, an Oscar-winning cinematographer with decades of experience. By the time he worked on the film, Lang was already a legend in Hollywood and was known to have shot classics like Some Like It Hot and The Big Heat. For The Magnificent Seven, he brought his sharp eye for detail and his love for wide, sweeping images. The movie was filmed using Panavision anamorphic lenses, which allowed Lang to capture that widescreen look the film needed. When you see the seven men lined up on their horses, spread across the screen with mountains in the background, that's Panavision doing its magic. Panavision gave audiences in 1960 a bigger, more cinematic view than most Westerns. Lang also knew how to frame intimacy within that broad scope. Watch The Magnificent Seven again. You will notice how he places the villagers in small and tight clusters while the seven gunfighters are often stretched out across the frame. This trick made the villagers look vulnerable and the gunmen look powerful. Elmer Bernstein's theme, Composition and Legacy. After the gunfights and showdowns have faded, one thing about The Magnificent Seven that remains in the memory of the film's fans is the music composed by Elmer Bernstein. When the film premiered in 1960, critics immediately called the music the eighth member of the cast because it gave the film its heartbeat. Bernstein admitted in interviews that the score came to him in bursts of energy. He also added that the idea of the score was to capture the feeling of horses in motion, with every trumpet call and drumbeat pushing the audience forward. Director John Sturges said, "Elmer gave me more movie than I had shot. He gave me size, scope, and rhythm, making my seven men feel like giants." The legacy of that theme grew far beyond the film. In the 1960s, the piece was adopted in commercials, most famously for Marlboro cigarettes, where it reached millions of people who might never have stepped into a cinema. Actor James Coburn joked years later in an interview, "You couldn't escape that music. You'd walk into a bar and there it was again if the TV was on." Elmer's tune became part of American culture. Bernstein's score was nominated for an Academy Award, though it lost that year. Today it's considered one of the most significant Western themes ever written. Stunt crew and real horse choreography. One of the things we have noted that makes The Magnificent Seven feel so raw and dangerous is how real the action looks. Looking back at the 1960s, special effects were limited, so most of the daring moments in the film, like men being thrown from horses, leaping from rooftops, or tumbling in the dirt, were done the hard way, with stunt performers taking the hits. Hollywood veterans like Henry Wills and Bob Terhune were brought in to handle the most challenging sequences of the film, and they helped design stunts that blended danger with style. The horse work was no joke because every chase, every fall, and every sliding stop was performed on live animals that did not always cooperate with the actors. Actor Robert Vaughn admitted years later, "We were constantly on horseback, and for some that was new territory. The stunt guys were fearless and made it look easy, but it wasn't." Charles Bronson, who played Bernardo, also commented on the physical toll of the production. "That Mexican dust, the heat, and those horses, by the end of the day, you felt like you'd been in a real fight." Brynner, who was already comfortable on horseback from earlier films, he took pride in doing much of his own riding, but the most dangerous falls and crashes were left to the professionals. Director John Sturges trusted his stunt team completely. In the documentary known as Guns for Hire, The Making of the Magnificent Seven, First Assistant Director Robert Relier recalled, "The stunt crew gave us authenticity. They weren't just falling off horses, but selling the story." Those efforts paid off because when you watch the final battle, Every fall and every charge carries the weight of real risk that couldn't be faked in a studio. Steve McQueen scene stealing and the car accident story. Steve McQueen was still a rising television star when he got his role in The Magnificent Seven. Even though Yul Brynner was the clear lead, McQueen kept finding ways to grab attention in scenes, often without saying a word. He would fiddle with his hat, load and unload his gun, or shake shotgun shells in his hand just enough to draw the eye. Robert Vaughn later recalled, "Steve had these little tricks. Steve would do something small if Yul spoke to ensure the camera noticed him. It drove Yul crazy." Director John Sturges noted that instead of stopping it, he encouraged McQueen, knowing it added energy to the film. The story of how McQueen even got into the film has become part of Hollywood legend because at the time, he was tied to the TV series Wanted, Dead or Alive. To get out of his contract long enough to film, McQueen supposedly staged a minor car accident. Producer Walter Mirisch later said, "Steve got into a fender bender to go to the doctor, claim he needed time off, and fly down to Mexico to shoot with us." This daring move paid off, and McQueen's screen presence was undeniable. Audiences couldn't take their eyes off him. Even Yul Brynner reportedly felt threatened, once telling friends that McQueen was stealing the movie frame by frame. By the time the film hit theaters, McQueen's career had skyrocketed. Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen's legendary tension. One of the most famous behind-the-scenes stories from The Magnificent Seven is the open rivalry between Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen. At the time, Brynner was already a Hollywood icon and got his Academy Award for The King and I, while McQueen was still climbing the ladder. Brynner, who was proud and theatrical, expected to be the clear leader both on screen and off. On the other hand, McQueen was restless and hungry and wasn't about to play second fiddle. Robert Vaughn once admitted, "You could cut the tension with a knife." Yul and Steve were two alpha males in a tiny room. One famous anecdote concerns the film's gun belts. Brynner wanted to appear taller and more commanding, so he had his costume department add special mounds of earth to stand on during certain scenes. When McQueen heard about this, his gun belt was adjusted lower on his hips, so his arms would hang naturally at his sides, making him look bigger and cooler. Walter Mirisch, the film's producer, later said, "It was a duel of gestures, really. Yul would try to dominate with posture, and Steve would counter with a shrug or a smirk. The camera loved both of them." Despite the friction between them, Sturges, the director, let it run because he believed the rivalry gave the film an extra edge, especially in scenes where the seven gunmen size each other up. Off-camera, though, the rivalry remained, and in later interviews, McQueen admitted, "I learned a lot from Yul, but he didn't like me much, maybe because I wouldn't bow down." And Brynner, years after, conceded in a rare moment of humility, "Steve was a force. I knew audiences would love him, maybe too much." Eli Wallach was almost not cast as Calvera. It's hard to imagine The Magnificent Seven without Eli Wallach's fiery performance as Calvera, the bandit leader. Yet it would surprise you that Wallach wasn't the first choice for the role. In fact, Yul Brynner originally wanted a bigger name actor to play the villain. Still, director John Sturges fought for Wallach after being impressed by his work in Baby Doll, which was released in 1956. Wallach himself admitted that he was shocked to get the part. In his autobiography, The Good, the Bad, and Me, he recalled, "I thought they wanted a Mexican star, someone the audience would immediately recognize. When they called me, I thought they'd made a mistake." The studio wasn't convinced either. Walter Mirisch, the producer, said in his memoir, "Casting Eli was a gamble. He wasn't a box office draw, but Sturges believed he had the right mix of menace and humor, and he was right." Wallach took the role personally by adding little touches that made Calvera unforgettable. He worked with a dialect coach to blend Mexican and Spanish inflections into his speech and improvised lines to make the bandit seem less like a caricature. In an interview, he said, "I didn't want Calvera to be just evil. He had to be charming enough that you could see why men followed him." The result of Wallach's actions was one of the most memorable villains in Western film history. Critics praised Wallach's layered performance. Even the cast admitted he stole many scenes. James Coburn once told a journalist, "Eli wasn't playing a villain, he was playing a man who happened to be on the wrong side. That's why it worked so well." James Coburn fought hard for his role. James Coburn's role as Brit, known as the knife-throwing gunman, rarely happened for him. In fact, Coburn was so desperate to be a part of the Magnificent Seven that he actively campaigned for it, even though bigger names were already in line for the part. Coburn later admitted in an interview, "I wanted that role so bad I could taste it. I kept calling Sturgis, telling him I was born to play Brit. I wasn't going to let anyone else have it." At the time, Coburn was relatively unknown, mostly appearing in small television parts. Initially, the role was offered to Sterling Hayden and then to John Ireland, but both turned it down, leaving Coburn with an opportunity he seized. He even credited his friend Robert Vaughn, who was already cast for the film, with putting in a good word for him. Vaughn once said, "Jimmy wouldn't shut up about that role. He wanted to be in Mexico with us, and he wanted to throw those knives. I told Sturgis, give him a chance." Coburn's determination to be a part of the film eventually paid off. He landed the role and trained intensely for the sequences where he had to throw knives, practicing for hours each day to make his movements look natural. He later joked, "I must have scared a few neighbors throwing knives into doors all day long." As Walter Mirisch later said, "James Coburn made silence louder than dialogue. That's why he fit perfectly into the Seven." Charles Bronson bonded deeply with the Mexican child actors. Charles Bronson's role as Bernardo O'Reilly gave him one of the most touching arcs in the Magnificent Seven because his role was to be the hardened gunfighter who becomes a father figure to the village children. What many people don't know about Charles Bronson and his role is that Bronson also carried that bond off-screen. While filming in Cuernavaca, Mexico, Bronson spent much of his free time with the local children cast as extras. While other actors would retreat between takes, Bronson often stayed behind, teaching the kids simple English words, sharing candy, or just listening to their stories. In an interview years later, Bronson admitted, "Those kids didn't have much. They followed me everywhere and I couldn't ignore them. They reminded me of my childhood, growing up poor in Pennsylvania." Producer Walter Mirisch also noticed it, writing in his memoir, "Bronson had a reputation for being tough and distant. But with those children, he melted. You could see the affection was genuine, which is why his scenes in the film feel so real." Robert Vaughn recalled a moment on set. "Charles was always quiet, but with the kids he came alive. The director didn't have to give him much direction. It wasn't acting because it was natural. This bond translated beautifully on screen, and the children's admiration for Bronson wasn't scripted because it was their genuine affection shining through. That authenticity helped make Bernardo's demise one of the most heartbreaking moments in the film, leaving both the characters and the audience grieving." Robert Vaughn struggled with nerves during filming. Robert Vaughn, who played the role of sharpshooter Lee, may have looked confident on screen, but behind the scenes, he was battling serious nerves. At the time of filming in 1959, Vaughn was still in his 20s and the youngest of the seven, and he was surrounded by seasoned personalities like Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, and Charles Bronson. In his memoir, A Fortunate Life, Vaughn confessed, "I was intimidated the entire time. Everyone seemed so sure of themselves, but I was convinced I didn't belong." He admitted to quitting the film early on, fearing he wasn't strong enough to hold his own against such a powerhouse cast. Director John Sturgis, however, noted that he noticed Vaughn's unease and used it to his advantage. Sturgis later told Vaughn, "That nervous energy is exactly what Lee should have. Don't hide it, use it." This advice turned what could have been a weakness into a strength. Vaughn's portrayal of Lee as a gunman who was haunted by his past and unsure of himself came across as authentic precisely because it mirrored his real emotions. Off camera, Vaughn struggled socially too. James Coburn remembered, "Bobby kept to himself a lot. He wasn't out drinking or raising hell like the rest of us. He was serious, almost too serious." But in the end, his performance added a needed layer of vulnerability to the group. Horst Buchholz, the German James Dean, clashed with the older cast. Horst Buchholz, who played the role of Chico, was the youngest member of the Magnificent Seven and was often referred to at the time as the James Dean of Germany. He brought youthful energy and intensity to the role. But behind the scenes, that same energy sometimes rubbed his older co-stars the wrong way. His co-stars noted that Buchholz was eager to prove himself in Hollywood, and he sometimes overplayed his hand. Robert Vaughn later joked, "Horst was like an excited puppy. He wanted every scene to be his." In another interview, James Coburn remembered and said, "He had talent, no doubt, but he was brash. Yul and Steve didn't have much patience for that." Yul Brynner in particular found Buchholz difficult. Producer Walter Mirisch said in his memoir, "Yul wasn't fond of Horst. He felt Horst was undisciplined and tried too hard to upstage him." Director John Sturges, however, defended the casting, saying Buchholz's impulsiveness made Chico feel real. That raw, unpolished quality was exactly what the role needed. He wasn't supposed to be polished like Brynner or McQueen. Buchholz acknowledged years later that he was a bit headstrong behind the scenes of The Magnificent Seven. In a German television interview, he said, "I was young, ambitious, and maybe I didn't always listen, but that's what made Chico alive." Despite the tension, his performance was vital to the film's heart. Also, Chico's journey from reckless youth to responsible protector gave audiences someone to root for. Sturges also deliberately placed him in the final scene with the villagers to show his role as the one who truly belonged. Filming in Mexico was brutal. The landscapes of The Magnificent Seven helped give the film its epic feel, but shooting on location in Mexico came at a serious cost, and it wasn't a financial cost. The cast and crew endured blistering heat, poor living conditions, and frequent illness. Robert Vaughn recalled in his memoir, "We were in Cuernavaca, and it was beautiful to look at, but miserable to work in. The heat was punishing, and we were all sick at one time or another." Steve McQueen, who was already known for being restless, reportedly complained about the lack of proper accommodations, joking that the bugs had a bigger budget than we did. Eli Wallach shared that even food and water were issues. "We had to be very careful. Many of us got sick from the local water, and you'd lose a day's work because someone was down with stomach trouble." Director John Sturges faced additional challenges in keeping the actors happy. Yul Brynner wanted certain luxuries, while others like James Coburn and Charles Bronson were more adaptable. Producer Walter Mirisch later wrote, "The film wasn't just about the Magnificent Seven on screen. It was about surviving 7 weeks in Mexico. That was the real challenge." Despite the hardships, the location paid off because the authentic Mexican village built for the film gave it a realism that couldn't have been replicated on a Hollywood set. Sturges admitted, "It was hell to shoot, but when I saw the dailies, I knew it was worth it." Elmer Bernstein's iconic score almost didn't happen. Elmer Bernstein's score for The Magnificent Seven is considered one of the greatest in film history because it is so recognizable that it was later used in commercials, parodies, and countless tributes. But at the time of production, the studio wasn't convinced Bernstein was the right man for the job. Producer Walter Mirisch admitted in his memoir, "The studio thought Elmer was too unproven. He had done the 10 Commandments and smaller pictures, but wasn't yet a household name. We had to fight for him." Bernstein recalled the pressure. "When I first played the main theme for John Sturges, he sat quietly, then smiled and said, 'That's it. That's the movie.' That was the moment I knew it would work." Interestingly, the score was not immediately celebrated. In fact, when the film was first released in 1960, critics paid little attention to the music. It wasn't until years later, when the theme was adopted for Marlboro cigarette commercials, that the music became iconic. Bernstein once laughed, "I thought I was writing for a Western, not a cigarette ad, but that gave the theme immortality." Robert Vaughn later reflected on the power of the music. "The score gave the film its heartbeat. Without it, we might have been just another Western. With it, we became unforgettable." Today, the Magnificent Seven theme is Bernstein's masterpiece and ranks among the most famous pieces of film music ever written. John Sturges' tricks to handle a difficult cast. Directing The Magnificent Seven wasn't just about staging gunfights and sweeping landscapes. It was about managing 7 very different and powerful-willed actors. John Sturges had to walk a fine line to keep the production from falling apart under the weight of egos. Sturges later admitted, "It was like being the referee in a boxing match that never ended. Everyone wanted to be the star." Yul Brynner expected top billing and respect. Steve McQueen kept trying to upstage him. Horst Buchholz was overeager, and Charles Bronson didn't talk much but commanded attention when he did. Walter Mirisch, the producer, remembered how Sturges handled it. John's trick was to let them think they were winning. If Steve were stealing a scene, John would praise him, but he'd ensure Yul got an equally strong close-up in the next setup. He balanced them like chess pieces. Robert Vaughn also noted how Sturgis used silence to assert control. When the set got noisy, John wouldn't yell. He would just sit there and smoke. Eventually, everyone got quiet because they knew he was waiting. It worked every time. Sturgis also had a knack for encouraging improvisation, but only if it served the scene. James Coburn once said, "John told me, do less, Jimmy. The less you do, the stronger you'll look." That advice made Britt who he was. Sturgis turned potential chaos into cinematic electricity by keeping egos in check and letting tension feed into performances. From box office disappointment to global triumph. When The Magnificent Seven was released in the United States in 1960, it was not the smash hit most people imagine today. In fact, it performed modestly at the box office, with critics often dismissing it as just another Western. The New York Times review even called it routine. Producer Walter Marish later admitted, "We were disappointed. It didn't make the money we had hoped for in the US." Part of the problem was later figured out as timing. The Western genre was overcrowded, but here's where United Artists' marketing team played a clever hand. Using their pressbook campaign, UA leaned into the film's action and international flair, selling it as a new kind of Western. In Mexico, for example, posters and trailers emphasized the heroism of the seven protecting villagers, tailoring the story directly to local audiences. Archival press materials show that UA pushed the tagline, "They fought like 700, a line designed to give the picture an epic scale. The strategy paid off overseas because the film was a massive success in France and ran for years in Paris theaters. In fact, French audiences loved it so much that it launched the careers of Steve McQueen, Charles Bronson, and James Coburn in Europe long before they became major stars in America. Mirisch later noted, "The French made The Magnificent Seven a classic. They saw something in it that American audiences had missed at first." Over time, thanks to repeated reissues, television broadcasts, and international acclaim, the film's reputation grew. The editing and tight production saved the film. While the stars drew attention, The Magnificent Seven's enduring power came from what happened behind the camera. John Sturgis and his first assistant director, Robert Relia, kept the production on a strict schedule, even when the Mexican heat, caste rivalries, and illness threatened to derail things. In the Guns for Hire documentary, Relia recalled, "Every day was a fire to put out, but John ran the set like a general. He was calm, efficient, and always 2 steps ahead." Sturgis relied heavily on planning his shots, often sketching entire sequences before filming to avoid wasting film stock or time. Then there was Ferris Webster, Sturgis's longtime editor. Webster had already cut classics like Bad Day at Black Rock. His touch was crucial here. Instead of lingering on scenes with heavy dialogues, he cut tightly between characters, letting glances, gestures, and pauses speak louder than words. Walter Mirisch once said, "Ferris gave the film its rhythm. John brought back great material, but Ferris turned it into the sleek, propulsive movie people remember." Even the action scenes, which could have become chaotic, were meticulously shaped in the editing room. James Coburn's knife fight and Charles Bronson's final shootout are often examples where editing created tension by stretching seconds into what felt like minutes. Without Sturgis's discipline on set and Webster's mastery in the cutting room, The Magnificent Seven might have been an overstuffed Western. Improvised demise and on-set creativity. One of the secrets of The Magnificent Seven is how much of its grit and humanity came from improvisation. While William Roberts' script gave the framework, the actors often added touches that made their deaths or quiet moments unforgettable. For instance, James Coburn's iconic knife duel was shot almost exactly as written, but the way he carried himself, silently flipping the blade and giving that half-smile before striking, was his own invention. Coburn later admitted in an interview, "I didn't want to say much, the knife was my line." Charles Bronson also shaped his role more than people realize. His demise scene, where the village children surround him crying, was scripted initially with fewer lines. Bronson suggested making his last words more direct to the kids. As producer Walter Mirisch recalled in Guns for Hire, "Charlie wanted the kids to feel like they had a father figure, even as he was dying. That wasn't in the script, that was Charlie." Eli Wallach, meanwhile, brought a playful unpredictability to Calvera, as many of his gestures, like casually snatching food from the villagers' plates or leaning into Yul Brynner's personal space, were not scripted. Wallach explained years later, "Calvera wasn't just a brute. He was a man who enjoyed his own mischief. I tried to make him dangerous and funny at the same time." Real villagers as extras. Unlike many Hollywood westerns of the time that relied on studio backlots, The Magnificent Seven was mainly filmed on location in Mexico, and the authenticity of the village came from real people. Most extras playing the humble farmers were residents from Cuernavaca and nearby towns. Their faces, clothing, and natural mannerisms gave the movie a sense of realism that no costume department could fully replicate. But this authenticity came with challenges because local authorities were cautious about how Mexico and its people would be portrayed on screen. As film historian Sergio de la Mora noted, there were negotiations with censors to ensure the villagers were not shown as weak or cowardly. Producer Walter Mirisch confirmed this in Guns for Hire. "We had to be respectful. Mexico was proud of its heritage, and we were guests telling a story on their soil." Eli Wallach later shared a lighter memory about working with the extras. "The children were not actors. They were kids from the village. When I rode in as Calvera, they were genuinely scared, and that wasn't acting. That was me looking like a monster to them." What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to share this video, like it, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, click on the video displayed on your screen.